Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and today we're going to be talking about the game balance of Arkham Horror. That's far too big of a topic though, so we're going to be breaking it up into chunks. And today we're just going to be talking about and analyzing the stat lines of the investigators themselves. Now, when I say that, I mean specifically the numbers for their 4 base stats, not their soak. I don't find the soak very interesting because all the investigators tend to follow the same pattern. And that pattern is that they have numbers between 5 and 9 in both stats that total 14. The exception being that monocolor investigators, like the Dunwich investigators and the starter deck investigators, add up to 15, and there are still 2 more outliers from that. Stella Clark adds up to 16, whereas Ashcan Pete, depending on how you count, gets different numbers. If you just look at his card, he adds up to 11. If you count Duke, that adds up to 16, but if you don't want Duke to ever die, it only adds up to 14 like a normal investigator. For today, we're going to be glossing over any further analysis of soak. We're just going to be talking about these stat lines. And more specifically, I want to find a way to judge the value of a stat line, and I want to get an average for each class to see how they compare. To start judging the stat lines, we need to figure out which characters we're judging. This isn't all the investigators, but it is all the investigators I'll be analyzing. And the reason is that these are what you could call standard investigators. They have stat lines that total up to 12 points, with 5 exceptions. Mark, Akachi, and Rita all add up to 13. They just have 1 bonus stat. Likewise, Carolyn and Ashcan add up to 11, and they have 1 less. You might think Ashcan has 1 less because he's a gimmick investigator, but since Carolyn exists, I just feel like he has gotten shafted, and it's not really anything to do with Duke. On the list of investigators I'm not going to be covering, first we have the gimmick investigators. You don't need me to tell you that Calvin has a bad stat line. And in fact, all analyzing him would do is drag down the average for red, so I'll be excluding this group of investigators. Like I said earlier, I want to find a way to judge the classes as a whole, which means the Edge of the Earth investigators don't really fit neatly into any one class, and consequently can't be put into the same assessments I'll be doing. At the end, once I've created whatever system I plan to use to judge the characters, I'll go ahead and include these characters and see how they stack up, but I won't be using them initially. Likewise, I won't be judging Lola Hayes because she's neutral, but if you really want to know, you can just look at Ginny Barnes because they have the same exact stat line. This first table is very simple. I've simply listed out all the investigators and gotten averages for them. All this really does is help us to reinforce our pre-existing beliefs about classes, and it highlights the problem with averaging our characters just using the stats as given to us. As you can see, if we sort this average table at the bottom by book, Seekers dominate, as they well should. But you'll notice the average book in Survivors is only 2.16. Likewise, the average Fist is only 2.83. It would imply that as a class, they're just worse than Schizo Tool, but in reality, what's happening is while they do have a relatively low proactive stats, the Cloovers and the Fighters are essentially averaging out to nothing. Which means that this metric isn't really that good, aside from allowing us to see how accurate some preconceiving notions that we have are. To go over some of the more meaningful preconceived notions that this confirms, obviously Mystics have the best head by a mile, but more importantly, Rogues have on average 1 less head than anyone else in the game. It is a glaring weakness that class has been assigned. Of course, if we were to sort it by Fist, we would see that Guardian is demolishing that, as they well should. But in a bizarre twist of events, it turns out that Rogues actually don't have the best average foot score. Between Tony's 2 in foot and Rita's 5 in foot, they managed to respectively weigh down and pull their classes enough that Survivors have a higher average foot than Rogues. It makes sense that Survivors would be in contention with Rogues for this title because, after all, they sort of specialize in having generally high defensive stats, but it's surprising to see that Rogues don't have the highest foot. It's not bad for Rogues they don't. Rogues have a lot of problems, and not having the highest foot isn't one of them. It's just salt in the wounds. What's more surprising to me is I never realized how bad, on average, the foot score of Guardians was. It's actually very slightly lower than a Rogue's brain. And I guess because brain is generally so much more important, I just never realized how bad Guardians were when it came to foot treacheries. However, that's the limit of what we can learn by averaging the stats out across the board. To do anything more than this, we're going to have to start using derived statistics. We're going to have to change the way we look at the class. When I first started the game, I looked at it as, on the left, I had my head and book, which were my mental stats, and on the right, I had my fist and foot, which were my physical stats. But that's sort of a useless thematic way of looking at the game. A much more analytical way of looking at the game is to look at your book and your fist as your proactive stats, the ones that you use to impact the game during your turn, and to look at your head and your foot as your reactive stats, the one that you're going to use to react to the Mythos deck and protect yourself. And from these sets of stats, we can actually look at some derived statistics. From the proactive stats, the first thing we can do is we can realize we only care about the higher of the two numbers. No character would optimally be using both their book and fist. There's a lot of reasons for this that I'll get into more in a future video, but the quick summary is that it's almost always better to do either investigating with book and fighting with events, or fighting with fist and getting clues with events. There are only a couple of characters in the game that can even consider trying to use assets and perform the roles in the standard fashion simultaneously, but even though you could theoretically do it on those characters, you'd generally be better served flexing in a different way or committing fully to one role, because spending all of those resources and all of those turns setting up both sets of assets tends to result in not actually playing the game enough. You just spend the whole time setting up and then the scenario ends, and you didn't really do a whole lot for your team. Our other stat is essentially wasted stats. When you're finding clues, your fist is irrelevant. When you're the fighter, you don't need your book score. And as a consequence, we can come up with a second derived stat of wasted stats. Our wasted stat isn't going to be our lowest stat, though. It's going to be our lowest stat -1 because you can't have less than 1 in a stat. Coming over to our reactive stats, I need to talk a little bit about a method called sum of squares. Sum of squares is a system I can use to represent that different stat lines have different values. 3 2s is far less valuable than a 4 and 2 1s. With sum of squares, what you do is instead of adding all your stats to get to 12, you square all your values and add them, getting a wide range of numbers from 20s to 40s that represent the difference in value of having larger numbers. And the reason it's going to be so varied is because it's going to be representing the difference in value of having more concentrated stat lines. Jenny Barnes is terrible, Mandy is incredible. The reason I bring up sum of squares now before I'm doing it is because if we're not going to count our wasted stats in our sum of squares, it's going to end up weighting things inadvertently. We're going to have 1 offensive stat and 2 reactive stats. And the way we can fix this is by using an average reactive stat as well. This actually does 2 things very important for us. The first is that it means we're decreasing the defensive values in a way that's proportional to how we've decreased offensive values. But the second thing that I actually think is just as important, possibly more, is if you look at someone like Rita Young, who has a 5 and a 3 defensively, her stat line's not actually that good. But without doing this and averaging out those defensive stats, that 5 and foot would be weighted just as highly as a 5 and fist or book, which is wrong. So by averaging the defensive stats, we mitigate the perceived value in the sum of squares system of having high defensive values. If we weren't doing this, Rita Young would be one of the most optimal characters in the game according to sum of squares. And apparently it's a contentious belief that I think Rita Young is one of the worst investigators in the game, but I think even Rita Young fans can look at her stat line and say that they very easily can change something about it to vastly improve it. If sum of squares is saying that Rita Young is one of the best investigators, then the input material we're giving it isn't good enough. So that's the big reason we're using average defensive values. And the second stat we're going to have is similar to wasted stats. It's a stat that we're not going to be putting into sum of squares, but it is also a stat that helps us understand how the character works. Whereas wasted stats is just for us to know and understand how the character got where they are, we're going to record the lowest defensive stat, the character's vulnerability. The reason we're recording this on our chart is so that when you look at sum of squares, wherever Finn Edwards is, wherever Winifred is, there's going to be a lowest defensive stat 1 to remind you, hey, sum of squares might say this character's really good, but they have a glaring weakness you need to think about. Speaking of an asterisk that is going to be necessary on this chart, the entire Mystic class, and honestly Safina Rousseau, who's a rogue that plays more like a Mystic and less like a rogue, need a giant asterisk. Because they don't use book or fist. So what I'm doing for them is I'm counting their head as their proactive stat. This is technically unfair, but honestly I would just say that's accurate to Mystics. What Mystics are doing is fundamentally really optimal. They're a class that attempts to leverage a defensive stat in a proactive way, and unlike rogues, they succeed at it enormously. With rogues, a couple rogues might rely on their foot score to a degree. But with Mystics, every single Mystic is wholly reliant on their head, so I don't feel bad about just counting their head score as their offensive value and then putting it into their average as well. So in this chart, what I've done is I've listed the characters with their highest proactive value and their reactive average. And I've added those numbers after squaring them to get their adjusted sum of squares. I'm not counting their wasted stats, and I'm not counting their lowest reactive stat. It's just there as a note for myself when I'm analyzing the characters. And then I've sorted the table by the values of the adjusted sum of squares. And honestly, despite how lopsided this table is, it feels very accurate. What Mystics are doing is fundamentally, at a stat line level, incredibly well optimized, so they should all be near the top. And in fact, Jim Culver is the only character that even hit the average of 25. Everyone else is much above that. However, because it's blatantly obvious that Mystics are the most well-optimized class, it's kind of just clogging up the table and making it harder to see what's going on. So I'm going to quickly remove all of them and talk more in detail about the other 4 classes that function in more traditional ways. Before I get rid of the Mystics entirely, though, I will talk about their average value. They are almost 50% more optimized at a stat line level than the bottom 3 classes, which are all relatively close to each other. The only class that holds a candle to them is Seeker. And we're going to talk about how broken Seeker is in more detail now. Oh, and if you were wondering what this 6/7 rogue is about, it's because Safina Rousseau, who is the best rogue according to these metrics, is really just a mystic. So now that I've removed all the mystics, we're going to count the rogues without Safina. If you agree with the way I view the game, that having an incredibly high single defensive stat is not as valuable as having a high proactive stat, that both defensive stats matter, but both offensive stats do not, and you think sum of squares is a good method to judge characters, and I think all those things are very true, then this is a chart that represents a pretty brute force level analysis of how well optimized the characters are. There's no nuance to it. It tells you that Jenny, Skids, and Winifred are all the same character. And to a degree, that's true. Jenny is just the average of Skids and Winifred. If you average those 2 investigators out, you would get Jenny. But at the same time, it's immediately obvious that Winifred has a better stat line than Skids, because they're both going to fail all their mythos tests, so you would rather have one more foot. There's a degree of nuance to judging characters in this table that is lost on the sum of squares. However, the sum of squares does generally represent a really effective way of seeing how strong characters are. And in terms of optimizing stat lines, Seekers are destroying the competition. Joe Diamond might be absolutely awful, but the other 6 Seekers on this list are all in the top 10. If you look at the averages for the adjusted sum of squares, 3 classes are neck and neck. They're all right next to each other. And Seeker is about 25% ahead of them in terms of their average values. That's not to say Seekers are 25% stronger as a class, just that when you're trying to visualize how much better their stat line is, they are tremendously more well optimized. And you can see that part of that is they waste almost no stats, but survivors are the same. The difference, however, is that survivors are pumping their defensive stats. Seekers are pumping their proactive stats. Seekers have the highest proactive stat in the game by a substantial margin over Guardians and absolutely crush both rogues and survivors. Whereas survivors spent their points that they saved having a higher average reactive value than other classes. And you can actually see that rogues, Seekers, and Guardians all form a neat little pack for reactive average. But because in my eyes this is a less valuable stat than a proactive stat, Seekers feel much more well optimized. However, the bigger issue is not that Seekers have more defensive stats than Rogues and Guardians. As a general rule, they don't. It's that they distributed them better. If we sort this by the lowest reactive stat, that pack breaks. Rogue and Guardian are still right next to each other. But Seeker left. They're only 0.15 behind Survivor now. They're a full 70% of a still point over the other 2 classes, over Rogues and Guardians, when it comes to whatever their vulnerability is. Seekers dump stat fist, they put some of it in book, and they put the rest of it in whatever their weakness would have been. And as an example, recently I was complaining to a friend about how much I hated Finn's stat line. I said that if Finn were a Seeker, his 1 head and 3 fists would be swapped, and before I could finish saying that, I just died laughing, because I realized that Finn was just the rogue version of Ursula. There is a character analogous to Finn in Seeker. It has exactly the stat line I was joking that Finn should have had. For whatever reason, when you look at the stat lines in Arkham Horror, after enough analysis, you start to realize that Seekers just spent their points really, really well. All the other classes, like Rogues and Guardians, have these clear weaknesses. Survivors aren't putting their points in anything proactive. Rogues and Guardians have clear defined weaknesses to the Mythos deck, and Seekers can't punch anyone, which they didn't want to do to begin with. At the start of this video, I said that I wanted to discuss game balance in Arkham Horror. That's true. But the bigger overarching point of this entire series is that Seekers are dominantly more powerful and more well optimized than every other class, and they are aggressively overpowered. There's a secondary point of, holy shit, why are Rogues so bad? Because not only do Rogues have the lowest sum of squares on this table, they also have the lowest brain in the game. And you can look at Guardians and say they have a bigger vulnerability, but when you actually sit down and play a game, Rogues feel like they are on a mission to get themselves killed. The simple fact is that foot is far less valuable than head in this game, not through any inherent aspect of the stats, but because of the actual treacheries that got printed for the scenarios. And I think the bigger issue with Rogues when it comes to their low head stat is, well, coming back here, the Guardians all have these bad foot stats. 2 in Cho, 2 in Roland, 2 in Zoe, 1 in Leo, 2 in Tommy, right? They have terrible foot stats. But that doesn't matter because they all have high health. When they fail grasping hands, they'll be fine. But all these rogues like Tony and Trish with bad head scores have low brain scores as well. So when you fail your rotting remains on them, you're not fine. You are halfway to dead. It just feels sort of horrifically unfair that even though these two classes have symmetrical weaknesses, because of the way their soak lines up, it does not feel symmetrical at all. And then when you compound that with the difference in Mythos decks, it's not even close. The weakness Guardians have is nothing in comparison to the weakness that Rogues have. Before I wrap up the video, though, I would like to talk about the Edge of the Earth Investigators. First, you'll notice that I have 3 copies of Lily Chen, and that's because of how her disciplines work. I think it's fair to count them as part of her base stats, but that's debatable. If you don't count them, she's at that group of 25 base characters. She's relatively right in the middle of the pack in terms of optimization. However, if you plan to start with +1 fist and you think it's fair to count that as part of your stat line, and I wholly agree with this, then she's at that 34 group of investigators that are the very top of the pack. Speaking of, Daniela Reyes is in that same exact group. She's incredibly well optimized. And unsurprisingly, if you were to take the brain and foot upgrade afterwards on Lily Chen, you would find that your 15 stat investigator has the best sum of squares of the game, because of course they do. But that's unsurprising and frankly irrelevant. Once we start talking about Lily Chen with 3 copies of Discipline, we may as well mention that Calvin, with 5 damage and 5 horror on him, would have a base score of 50 and make all of these characters look like absolute trash. Norman Withers has a very high score at 31.25. He fits right in with the rest of the Seekers, and is generally just a very well-optimized character. And lastly, Monterey Jack at 25 and Bob Jenkins at 22.25 both fall into this huge pack of characters that make up the middle of the chart that have relatively average stat lines. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope I didn't gloss over anything or do anything too quickly. This is actually the second time I'm recording this video because it completely corrupted and destroyed itself the first time I recorded this. So hopefully the fact that I'm on tilt doesn't come through in the video. Hopefully this was enlightening or at least entertaining. And if you did like it, then a like, comment, subscribe, and all of that stuff. It really helps the channel grow. Anyways, I've been rather incoherent, and I'll see you in the next one.